Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Torn Walker TV. My name is Torn Walker. The issue of reparations for African Americans has been a concept in American politics since Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order 15 on January 16, 1865. That order designated roughly 400,000 acres of land from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Florida to newly freed Black families in 40-acre segments. That's where we get the concept of the idea of 40 acres and a mule. That order was never executed, but the idea of former slaves and their descendants being compensated for free labor has never stopped being an issue for African Americans, and that debt has gained new steam in current political discourse. My guest is one of a small but growing number of political candidates who've made reparations for African Americans a centerpiece of their political campaigns. Please welcome former candidate for Chicago City Council Ward 5, Gabriel Piemonte. Gabriel, how are you doing?
It's good to be here, Torrin. Thank you so much. I'm doing well. A little warm. We're approaching 90 degrees today in Chicago.
Really? That's like Florida weather.
Yeah, it is. We got the stickiness too.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's get right into it. How did you first become familiar with the concept of reparations for African Americans?
So I've been aware of the concept of reparations as a contemporary thing. I think a lot of people understand it as a historical blip, but I understood it as a temporary moment starting in the 80s when, as an undergraduate attending university, I was in the political science department. There was a gentleman who had formerly been a Black Panther. He was, in addition to teaching during, for classes, he mentored a small group of us on issues sort of in a real world setting. And it was in that context, and in particular, in a project called the Mandela Project, which was an effort to incorporate a part of Boston, Roxbury, Boston, out of the city of Boston, that I really learned about the idea of, of debt that's owed to Black Americans and understood in kind of its fullness the implications of that. More recently, I ran, so I've run twice now for Alderman. The first time I ran, I was talking about redistribution of resources in the ward and city, and I was approached by people in the contemporary reparations movement who said, you should just say reparations. That's really what you're talking about. And we started having a conversation, and I was very open to being educated about what people, how people were organizing around these issues and in the Black community. And so I basically got an incredible education that really made me understand what was going on in the movement today in 2020.
That's actually interesting that you say that because you don't hear a lot about reparations in people from communities outside of the African American community. So was it more sort of like an eye-opening thing for you when you understood like the background of how that came about and the demand in the Black community for and a lot of activists about that debt being repaid?
Well, I think what surprised me was that it had gained so much popular interest in the Black community while have there being almost like a media blackout. This was in, I'd say, around 2019. I really started to do a deep dive, and you did not hear about any of this except in very negative terms about small um, sort of offshoots of the movement. But the mainstream movement, all of the people across the country who were involved and dedicated to this idea that reparations could happen in contemporary America, I was surprised. And I was surprised in part because in Chicago, there's always been a call for reparations, but a lot of the people who talk about reparations, who you see more visibly locally. I live on the south side of Chicago. So when you'll see people talk about reparations, I'd say 2010, 2015, you're hearing from people who are saying all Black folks who ever, have lived in America deserve reparations. And so that's a different kind of argument than the one that I've really received kind of deep instruction about, which is a lineage-based reparations argument. And yeah, I was real surprised that it had been kept such a secret even where I live in a neighborhood that's 85% Black. I live in a ward that's 58% Black. But if you weren't in the know, you didn't know. And so part of what we've been trying to do is change that and make it a broader conversation.
Okay, well, you did a little bit more than make it a broader conversation. When you decided to run for political office, you made it a platform plank. And that is, at the time when you did that, that was a very rare thing to see someone running for political office make the idea of reparations part of their platform policy. What brought you to that? What brought you to that decision?
Well, I was I had run, as I mentioned earlier, I had run once before. I'd gotten involved since that time um, in the movement, the national movement. And when opportunity presented itself to run again, and I started reaching out to people to see, where there'd be strong support and where I'd have a strong organizational team. It was really the reparations community that was there for me in terms of being able to say, what's a strong platform we can put together. And so, not surprisingly, as we were developing it, it became clear that the most politically relevant thing that we could do, and we all agreed on it, was to really build a platform, even though we're talking about local election, and we're not, none of us, neither me or the folks that I worked with, believe in the idea of reparations being local. We all believe in it being federal, but we believed in it as a framework, and we believed in it as a way to center the priorities of Black Americans in policymaking. And so it became, to us, the best tool for instruction that we could come up with. And so that's sort of how it worked. I believe in reparations. I believe in it as a federal policy. I think it's critical. It's the precondition to a lot of the other kind of social problems we're trying to fix. But it also works very well when you try to understand why we have the challenges we have in our many of our communities.
Um, well, let me ask you this: how did that play out on the stump when you had to go around and you had to get people's vote and you had to bring the conversation around reparations into a conversation with about voting for you? Did that play out well? Was there any sort of like resistance? Were people really open to the idea, or was there a lot of education you had to do in the neighborhood, or how'd that work?
There was a tremendous amount of education, and so out of the work we did this, so we had a strong social media presence as well. So we were knocking doors, we're making phone calls, we're participating in forums. There were several debate forums, and it was a challenge. At the same time, a lot of people were very receptive. I think there was skepticism because I'm a white candidate talking about this, but at the same time, it was very telling that there were a whole group of us. So 11 people ran for this office, and ours was the only campaign, not only the only campaign that was talking about reparations, but when we started the race, nobody else was talking about policy specifically focused on Black Americans on their websites or their literature. So everybody was trying to. Our ward includes the University of Chicago, obviously significantly white um, community around that university, and so they were sort of trying to play um, both sides. So not really talking too much about commitment to issues, specifically solutions for Black Americans, for freedmen, and so that was a big. It was a big difference. It was a big contrast. Ultimately, we were not very successful in this campaign. In the last run, I got about 25% of the vote. We got under 5% this time. But as I said, there were like 11 people running. We had a candidate who was incredibly well financed. He spent $300,000 for this, this local political position, and so that really made it challenging for a lot of us to get the word out. But in the end, the impact I think goes well beyond what those numbers might suggest, because people are interested. People have been contacting us since then, and we're continuing to work. So I think to the extent that we wanted to run a principled, policy-driven campaign that really centered the issues of Black Americans, we succeeded, and a lot of people appreciated that. Even people who ultimately didn't choose us as their first choice among I think there were 10 of us that actually made it to the ballot. Nevertheless, when I talk to people on the street, when we have conversations about the campaign, People really appreciated it. So I feel like it was an important experience. And the truth is, for reparations to happen, we have got to have more people willing to take these initial steps that haven't been taken very often. As you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, that people aren't willing to do this. If we don't have candidates willing to do this, and if we don't have reparationists willing to support those candidates, we're not going to get anywhere. So somebody or some group of people have to start doing this. I'd say Marcel, the gentleman who ran for Congress down south, Marcel Dixon, I'd say
Mhm.
he's really the pioneer, but that in terms of local politics, there are a handful of us who have now done this, three or four across the country who are, reparationists, and it's critical. We need many, many more people doing
Well, since your campaign and since other people are starting to become more vocal about adding this to their platform policy, reparations has sort of become a popular topic of conversation among a lot of people in the federal government, definitely in state and local governments. Do you feel like there's going to be some movement on the issue on the state and local level, and eventually on the federal? Because it's
it.
definitely a major topic now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to see movement. The challenge we face actually is the language of reparations is so broad. How people talk about it, there's such a range of things that people are really talking about when we use the term. That a challenge for us now, even more so than trying to get people to think about it as an important policy consideration, is to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So we have here in Chicago, just north of us, there's a town called Evanston, Illinois, and a lot of people who follow reparations follow Evanston because they have a housing grant program that they branded as reparations. It's gotten a ton of press as a result of that. It's really just a housing grant, and initially, how it was designed, you couldn't even get the money, so there wasn't you didn't actually get cash. No one wrote you a check. They said, we'll give you $25,000 if you kind of made, you had to, first of all, meet a strict set of criteria, and then there was a lottery. And then you could only spend this money on home repair. So it was they were sort of policing what you did with the money. On several levels, this is not reparation. The challenge we face now is across the country, you have folks who are using that language because it makes their equity program or their social spending program or their housing grant program sound more woke, I guess, for lack of a better word. But in fact, it's really just it's the same old stuff. We've got to talk about. I support reparations federally because we've got to really talk about a sea change. We have to shift the access of our economy. We have to shift the fundamentals of how we do business in this country. And the only way we do that is if we face our past, if we face this debt that's owed, and not a housing grant program or a lottery for folks to win a little bit of money.
I want to stay on that a little bit because you hear that in a lot of political situations where there's a concept that starts at the grassroots, and then the language that people are talking about on the grassroots level gets kind of co-opted into these ideas that don't have really anything to do with the original idea outside of a very cursory level. Um, do you have anything in place, or does your group or other people who are serious about reparations have anything in place to kind of like control that language and to make sure the words that are used mean the things that they're supposed to mean?
That's such a good question, and it's an ongoing conversation. Part of the challenge we face is that there's so much money behind the idea of symbolic programs being called reparations. There are foundations across the country who are funding this messaging. So we really are up against
Really?
it's a huge challenge because there's a viable, fairly powerful uh, uh, group of entities and individuals who want this to be symbolic. They essentially they want funding for their organizations or for them personally. They want to be able to tour the country and get their picture in the paper or whatever, and then give folks who are dealing with a wealth gap that is not their fault, but is the consequence of centuries of theft. not just during slavery, but since slavery, with things like the Homestead Act and Social Security and things of that nature, that there's real money that needs to be paid out, and not just the money. And this is the other element that's frustrating. Reparations is a number of things, including acknowledgement of a harm that's been done, and achieving satisfaction in terms of those who have been wronged, that the harm won't be repeated. And those are critical elements that you're not going to get from some local program that helps you put, aluminum siding up on your house or whatever. It's just not. It's not in proportion. What we are attempting to do, and we're doing this in a few different parts of the country, is to create models that are more consistent with this more serious-minded interpretation of what reparations are. And the idea is that we achieve one of these, and it becomes sort of the alternative. So when someone's thinking about implementing a reparations program in their city or town or state, that there's a model that they can look at that's actually functioning, um, and there's an alternative. Other than that, I think the thing that's happening right now that I think a lot of people need to pay attention to is the is Dr. Sandy Darity, who is just a leading light in all of the when we talk about reparations, we're talking about Dr. Darity. Uh, has just published a book, the Black Reparations Project, and this is itself sort of a model that people could look to, that would give them an idea of how to implement serious-minded reparations. So there already is a model in print, and then implementing it is something that we're working very hard to do in several locations across the country. And certainly, um, we have to say, I have to say, the California, what ended up happening in California, and we've just seen the final report of the task force yesterday, as well as lots of commentary from just regular folks from the state, as well as all of the task force members, profoundly influenced by the grassroots work that's being done, a lot of which is happening in California itself. I mentioned earlier on Twitter today, if it weren't for the grassroots folks who are fighting for lineage-based reparations, the direction that California was drifting into was reparations for African Americans, and that was going to be the plan. Huge pushback from the movement that I'm talking about, folks who are really trying to, emphasize that reparations is federal, it's cash-based, and it's lineal. And that third part was critical. Literally, on the day that the final report was released in California, the Supreme Court threw out race-based programs that are considered affirmative action, affirmatively trying to improve the conditions of people based on race. If if California had stayed in the lane of reparations for African Americans, that report, which is 1,100 pages long, would have been worthless the day it was published, because it would have been an affirmative action program. I have no doubt that that very same day, Republicans from California would have taken it to court and said it didn't meet the new strict scrutiny rules that the Supreme Court has laid out. So it's making an impact. The challenge we face is that there's a cacophony in the discourse. There are lots of different voices, and it can be hard to hear, who's really pursuing the best policy, because of course we all think we're doing the best, right?
Hmm. Well, let me ask you about that because California has been leading the way in this fight as far as like in the public sphere and also from the research and everything and actual direct movement. Since they have, since they were able to shift the conversation directly and avoid some of the pitfalls that happened that we saw over the past couple of days, what does that look like for the rest of reparations movements around the country, do you think?
It's a good question. I mean, we have deep problems. So California is special. First, the number of Black Americans that can seek redress through this process, the number of freedmen who can identify themselves as having been harmed in through the policies of California, relative to the total population, is fairly small. Also, California is a colossal economy compared to the economies of almost every other state. So that combination is rare. Texas, for example, obviously a robust economy. There is not a political climate for reparations, and even if there were, the number of Black Americans in Texas is huge, more than any other state in the union, meaning the payout would be substantial. This is one of the reasons why, um, federal reparations, not only does federal reparations make sense in terms of this being a series of policies that the federal government really orchestrated, implemented, oversaw, but also the federal government is the only government entity that can print money in the country. So, you can't if the dollar amount, if you're just trying to get to truth, and the truth of the harm you've done is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per person, most states won't be able to measure up to that. So I think what's great about California is they were able to listen to a bunch of people. They were able to adjust what they were doing based on what they were hearing. There was a really powerful grassroots movement that helped support what was happening. The appointment of Chairperson Moore, which I think for a lot of people, she was critical and sailing the ship into the harbor, was a grassroots recommendation that came from the folks who are doing this work on the ground. Lots of positive things to take from it. California, in my view, is not, you can't take the policy and move it to another state and put it into that state. It's an absolutely unique circumstance. And I just wonder if there's the same appetite for reform and progressive politics in the rest of the country. We have a reparations commission here in Illinois. It's been, it didn't do anything for a very long period of time. It's now functioning with nearly half of the slots that they're mandated to fill still unfilled. And, it's just not clear what's going to happen there. No public meetings. Everything has been done in secret. And I think a lot of states are going to be like that. Other states, people are trying to get paid to be on the commission. Once that happens, you run into all kinds of problems. So, lessons to be learned for sure. But at the same time, we need to recognize that, as we say in so many different arenas, California is different. California is special. And it's not clear how many other states will be able to replicate their achievement, which is fine. It's still an extraordinary accomplishment.
Well, what does reparations for Chicago look like to you? What would be the plan if you were to implement a reparations initiative or a reparations plan for the city of California and the state of Illinois?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that. We talk about local plans connected to reparations as reparative justice. I'm not um, trying to create a local program that that claims to repair the harm or come to terms with the harm that's been done because of national forces. I don't think that makes sense. So what Chicago can do is take the framework of reparations and apply it to local issues. When I was running, the issue that I would point to as the kind of best example of how we can do that is housing. Uh, we have a lot of data about housing in Chicago, and in fact, California. This is a good example of how California is a good model. In their reports, similarly, they identify housing as a huge source of the harms that were done in the state. And so in Chicago, the same thing applies city and state. And so I think what you do is you look at the harms, and I'm actually kind of in the middle or in the process of a pretty substantial research for uh, what I hope will be a pretty impactful article that's going to break down some of this, because we can identify the location of where policies were deliberately implemented against Black Americans, and what that means is those are addresses and those are people. And so what happens a lot, I think, is we see academic studies, we see foundations issue reports, and we they talk about harms that have been done to people, and we all say, "What a shame! That's too bad. We should do something about that." Reparations as a framework um, teaches us that you do not look at the past as something that's gone and forgotten. The past informs the present. There is a growing body of outstanding scholarship that is documenting a range of harms that have been done as a result of redlining, which is one particular form of housing discrimination that it sort of began in the 30s and 40s when these maps kind of indicated where lending shouldn't happen. And there's a growing body of research that shows a range of harms from education to medical harms like incidences of cancer and asthma to employment damage that link to those same maps that the impact of housing discrimination is continuing across generations. Well, to me, that has all of the characteristics of a harm that requires a reparative process to address. Meaning, we can quantify all of that. If you have medical harms, there's we can attach a dollar amount to that. If you have negative education outcomes, and there's one great study that was done in Chicago that shows the impact young people, children in areas that were redlined, and again, this is nearly 100 years ago, are still seeing negative impacts. There are still negative outcomes as a result of the policies, and that's a little. I can get into how that plays out a little bit, but the bottom line is, everything was impacted by the framework that was laid in the 30s and 40s, the racist framework during the New Deal era that we think of as this progressive era. At the same time as white folks were getting free jobs just so everyone could get employed, black folks were not only being left out of that, but they were also being denied home loans, and all of that has had impact that I would argue, and what we're working towards need is a debt that needs to be repaid. Not necessarily the federal, although there is a federal component. So some of this data could be used to bolster the federal argument. But the city of Chicago is an active abettor in this process and an agent of discrimination, as well as several private banks and other corporations, and they need to pay. That's what I would start there.
You ran in as an independent, correct?
Yes.
What kind of response did you get from independent political organizations about centering reparations in your campaign? And what kind of response did you get from establishment Democrat organizations about centering reparations in your campaign?
Uh, very hostile, very hostile. So the
Really?
challenge, even among independents, the challenge, the conversation behind closed doors in these political circles is that it is a bad idea to center Black Americans in policy making. That at the most, the best you can do is come up with policies to help a bunch of people, including Black folks, and that's the Bernie Sanders model, right? A rising tide lifts all boats, which is really you know is derived from the Ronald Reagan model, where we've drifted so far to the right that when you say, this is the group that is harmed, and from which the strategies that America uses to harm and oppress and take wealth from Black folks are then applied to everyone else. So it even makes common sense to start where the harms start. But the political, what everyone says is you do this and we just can't support you because you've got to have your arms open for everyone. And this really became a third rail when immigration started to become an issue. And that was, already it's been an issue for years and years, but in the campaign, it started to really emerge sort of, towards towards election day when it became clear that the mayor was going to be opening a migrant center um, in Woodlawn, where I live, that in an 85% Black community. And later, after the election, we found out there's going to be a second one in a 95% um, Black community. And so then there was a real rift because my position was, I'm not against immigration. I'm not. I think this country has the capacity to put everyone to work. We choose not to. I think that's why you've got to do reparations first, because our economic system is designed to have a certain number of people suffer, and that's always going to be, disproportionate, black folks. But my bottom line is, if you're going to bring um, folks, undocumented folks, to the south side of Chicago and put resources into the facilities you're giving them, you've got to at least match those with investment in the broader Black community. It just doesn't make sense that you wouldn't. That conversation makes especially white progressives really angry. They don't want to hear
That's interesting because, from the Democratic side, from the establishment Democratic side, every 2 to 4 years, we get the same speech that Black people and Black voters are the backbone of the Democratic Party. But when it's time to address some specific concerns and specific harms to the Black community, all you get is a lot of lip service, at least from the federal level, definitely from the Democratic establishment party, the DNCC, people like that. You would think that something like this would be something they could get behind to even shore up, even from a basically Machiavellian political standpoint, to just shore up Black support to keep them in line in a way, for lack of a better term. But you couldn't
No,
even
you're
get that.
right. You're absolutely right, and it's baffling. I mean, what it seems like is, first you've got the pressure from the federal level, and I think, what the Democratic Party on a national level does is, um, they're going to keep playing this angle until there's a huge backlash from Black folks, is my opinion. I think you've got to see, a dramatic drop in voting, and you may even have to see a switch over to Republican, people voting for Republicans, but at least a dramatic drop in the number of Black folks who go out and vote for the president, who go out and vote in those national elections. So pressure from them, but also locally, there's a real, the Democratic Party doesn't want to have a public conversation about Black and brown conflict. And
Mm.
so, we've got real challenges, but everyone puts a happy face on, the situation, and sort of asserts that there's a Black and brown coalition that fights together for justice. But Black folks are, well aware of what's happening. So they're looking at the policy decisions and they're saying, well, you can't exclude us. The idea that there's some kind of a permanent alliance between Black and brown folks is just a fiction that the Democratic Party puts out there all the time. But I'll tell you, in this last election, in the general election, running the mayoral election, the guy who won, Brandon Johnson, Brandon Johnson, definitely ran a progressive campaign and talked a lot about resources for everybody, but emphasized resources for immigrants, emphasized the sort of the priorities of the white and Latino elements of the coalition. And he came in third in almost every precinct in the south and west sides of Chicago. And nobody talks about this. All of the press is about how, he brought this coalition together. Well, Black folks voted for him in the runoff election against Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis had the Fraternal Order of Police endorsing him. One of the cops who killed Laquan McDonald donated to Paul Vallis. It's not like Black folks were like, well, I've got two progressive candidates, but I'm going to go with this guy because I like this, rhetoric. Plan B was a nightmare. So when they had a choice, there's a fairly conservative millionaire by the name of Willie Wilson who ran, and then Lori Lightfoot, the incumbent. Both of them in almost every precinct on the south and west sides. One came in first, one came in second. Brandon Johnson was third. Where Brandon Johnson did well on the south side was in the Hyde Park area, where the precincts had substantial white numbers of registered voters, and in a couple of other places where Tony Preckwinkle, who's the president of the Democrats here in Cook County, had a lot of sway. By and large, his message wasn't enthusiastically embraced. Let's say that, and we've got to have an honest conversation about this because of exactly what you said. We're coming around to the 2024 election, and we're seeing the same rhetoric from Joe Biden, and I've done great things for y'all, and people aren't buying it. I mean, it's really my fear is that there's going to be a swing to the right that's irrevocable. And the truth is that would be very bad for a lot of folks, including me and my neighbors. But the Democratic Party I couldn't blame anyone who says I don't trust them and they haven't done anything for us. I couldn't disagree. I mean, in Chicago, it's been horrible. We still have a horrible police department. It was a Democrat who closed 50 schools, almost all of them black majority schools, several years ago. Rahm Emanuel. CTU did nothing when that happened. You know, they wrote press releases, but all the striking that they've done, they didn't strike for that. There's a lot of bitterness, acrimony, bad feelings. That doesn't get you, if nothing else, that does not get you robust voter turnout. And that may be what they need. If Donald Trump ends up running again, you know, white people
Mhm.
seem to be ready to crawl through glass to vote for that guy.
Yeah. Speaking of that, yesterday, the Supreme Court essentially abolished affirmative action for college admissions. Greg Abbott in Texas proposed to ban federal bailout funds for any state that issues reparations. How will the growing push for reparations be able to continue momentum in the face of the opposition to reparations?
This is an excellent question, and it is. It's a huge. The opposition is huge, but the advantage that that lineage-based federal reparations has as a movement over other approaches is that um, you know we're not creating the burden on a local, state, or city level that other calls are, and we're not dealing with a scope as broad as other groups are. So there is, pardon me, there is
Mhm.
a national movement, and it's you can't. It's kind of inescapable when you look at the range of ideas people have about what reparations means, you know, ideas like Evanston are a kind of bottomless policy pit because once they give out their $25,000 to a few hundred people, they actually haven't redressed the issues. They haven't atoned for the issues. They haven't solved problems. They've called it reparations, but they haven't repaired anything. So, people can justifiably go back to Evanston and say, you've got to do more. That's deeply problematic. The approach to reparations that's known as the, Pan-African approach, which is sort of everybody can claim with any connection to, you know, whether you were born in America, if you're a black person born in America, or you came here, or there's, folks in your family who are black, that you have access to redress, introduces a pool of um, people who can, uh, petition for this that is huge and very difficult to define. So when you look at all of the options, an approach that says this is about Black Americans, this is about descendants of enslaved Black American citizens. It's federal cash money, and that's the level that we're going to operate on, and it's lineal. You've got a narrow, sort of thoughtful approach. An example, so folks are right now the conservatives are sort of tearing over the affirmative action decision. Uh, Reparationists are also having a conversation that says, this isn't necessarily problematic for us because what it really says is you've got to delineate on a different basis, and lineage is one option. And Clarence Thomas even specifically talks about lineage as one possible formula. Uh, for for folks who are Black Americans, for folks who are descendants of enslaved Black American citizens, there's a path forward that operates. It's a better version of affirmative action in the sense that we've seen the studies. White women made huge gains as a result of affirmative action when they were intended initially to help, specifically to help Black folks. Lineage-based solutions may be a better approach. So I say all that to say that the policy solutions that federal lineage-based cash reparations introduce are more complex and across the political spectrum in ways that I think a lot of other policy doesn't actually do. Of course, there are people who just don't want to give anything to Black folks, and there's the arguments, the bootstrap arguments, and all that. But those are arguments you're going to have with any program that helps regular folks. So, reparations has the same challenge that Social Security has, and you've got to face it, the same that public schools have, and it's to the advantage of the Democratic Party to get smart about bringing this into in a real way into the conversation, because you can enlist a lot of people who are otherwise disaffected and alienated from the electoral process and don't participate.
All right. Last question. What's next for you, Gabriel? What's next for you politically? What's next for you professionally on this issue?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on a piece that I'm so far from actually having it completed that I hesitate to say, I'm going to publish it or whatever. But I do want to lay out and kind of an illustration of how uh, we can use local data to make a case for reparative redress for Black Americans based on these prejudicial practices that took place all over the country, and really make it about making folks whole and not just saying it's too bad that we've been prejudiced in the past, which is not, is not sufficient. I'm also in conversation with folks who are doing reparative uh, work all over the country, and I very well may be announcing participation in a project that I don't want to really say anything about, but that has, I think, the potential to achieve sort of the thing I was talking about earlier, that this kind of model. But in general, that's my interest. So I want to get some more research out there, because I think those are powerful tools. The movement uses research to great effect. So the more of it we have, the better off. And then I want to do what I can to support serious-minded programs to, on the one hand, pardon me for the coughing. On the one hand, really seriously address these issues and face them on a local level and come to terms with some of the things that have been done to Black Americans historically, but then also to tie those local efforts to a support for the ultimate goal, which is the federal policy to provide reparations for every region in the country.
All right. What do you think about another political run? Is that on your mind? Have you decided yet?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to cross that bridge when I get to it. One of the things that was very clear. So, one thing I didn't mention to you is about money. When I ran this last time, I had people very specifically who had supported me in the past very specifically tell me that they weren't going to support me because of my position on reparations. So, you've got to be, if you're going to be if your policy is going to be honest and right up front, and it's not necessarily what people want to hear, then you've got to be able to draw on money outside of donations. We got a huge amount of donations from across the country, $5, $10, $25, uh, from reparationists. We had reparationist phone banking for us. It was really, it was wonderful. But we definitely need more resources. So that would be, you got to think about, well, where's the money coming from? And that's a big question for us, just in general, for all of the work we're trying to do. It's hard because we're the folks who aren't looking for a check. We're looking to solve the problem. So, um, we're not necessarily in a position to do this stuff that's sort of at will. We also have to pay the bills.
Understood. Trust me, I understand that part of it. So how can people find you and find your work? And if they want to contribute to your work, how can they get a hold of you?
I appreciate that question. For now, I encourage people to get a hold of me on social media. I'm revamping my personal website, and so if you go to at Gabriel Piemonte um, on Twitter, or if you go to Facebook and search Gabriel Piemonte, you'll find me, and I can be reached through direct message either way, either Facebook Messenger or a DM on Twitter. And please feel free to email me as well. My email is gabrielpiemonte@gmail.com. So you've got the spelling. Let me see if I can point right. You've got the spelling here, and it's just in all of those three places. I'm usually pretty easy to get a hold of. And then once again, I'll have our website live soon enough.
All right, Gabriel Piemonte, reparationist, political candidate, scholar. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate your time and I appreciate you inviting me on.
All right, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.